The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe Manor had barely finished flickering when Eleanor Whitfield heard the words that would change everything. "You are dismissed." The voice belonged to Lady Margaret Colville, cousin to the Duke of Ashcombe, and it cut through the music and laughter of the ballroom like a blade through silk. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, her gloved hands folded in front of her pale blue gown, as every eye in the room turned toward her. She had spent 3 years as companion to the Duke's aging aunt, 3 years of quiet service, careful words, and unnoticed kindness. And now, in front of half the nobility of the county, she was being cast out like a servant caught stealing silver. "I beg your pardon," Eleanor said, though her voice did not shake. She had learned long ago that shaking hands and trembling voices only invited more cruelty. Lady Margaret's smile was thin and satisfied. "The Duke no longer requires your services, Miss Whitfield. Your conduct this evening has been noted, and it will not be tolerated in this house." Eleanor searched the crowd for Alexander, the Duke of Ashcombe, hoping to find some sign that this was a mistake, some flicker of protest in his eyes. But he was across the room, deep in conversation with a group of gentlemen, his back half turned, seemingly unaware that his cousin had just humiliated a woman who had cared for his family for 3 long years. He did not look at her. He did not come to her defense. And in that silence, Eleanor understood that whatever kindness she believed had grown between them meant nothing at all. She would not cry. She would not beg. She lifted her chin, gathered the remains of her dignity, and sank into a curtsy so perfect, so composed, that several guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they were witnessing grace or quiet defiance. "As you wish, my lady," Eleanor said. Then she turned and walked out of the ballroom, past the whispering guests, past the glittering chandeliers, past the portraits of Ashcombe ancestors who had never once looked kindly upon a woman without title or fortune. She did not stop at the cloakroom for her shawl. She did not stop to collect her belongings from the small room she had occupied near the servants' quarters. She simply walked, out through the great oak doors and into the cold night air, leaving the warmth and light of the manor behind her. The gravel drive stretched long and dark ahead of her, lined with tall hedges that swallowed the moonlight. Somewhere behind her, the music continued, as though nothing at all had happened, as though a woman's entire life had not just been dismantled in a single sentence. Eleanor walked until the manor's lights disappeared behind the trees, and only then did she allow herself to stop, to breathe, to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. She had no family to return to. Her parents had died when she was 17, leaving her with a small inheritance that had long since been spent on her education and her keep. She had no home, no position, and now, thanks to Lady Margaret's cruelty, no reputation either. Word would spread quickly through the county. No respectable household would take in a companion dismissed in disgrace from the Duke of Ashcombe's own ballroom. The night was growing colder, and clouds were gathering thick and heavy above the treetops. Eleanor pulled her thin gown tighter around her shoulders and continued walking down the long road that led away from the estate toward the village of Marlow Cross, though she was not entirely certain what she would do once she arrived. She had perhaps a few coins in the small purse tied to her wrist, hardly enough for a night's lodging, let alone passage anywhere else. As she walked, her mind returned again and again to the moment Lady Margaret had spoken those words. "You are dismissed." There had been something rehearsed in the way she said them, something too precise, too satisfied, as though she had been waiting for the perfect moment to deliver them. Eleanor thought of the letter she had found earlier that week, tucked half hidden in the drawer of the library desk. A letter written in Lady Margaret's hand, addressed to a solicitor in London, discussing matters of inheritance and the Duke's unmarried status. She had not read enough of it to understand its full meaning before footsteps in the hallway forced her to close the drawer. But now, walking alone in the darkness, she wondered if that letter had something to do with what had just happened to her. She wondered, too, about Alexander. In the quiet hours they had spent together over the past months, walking the gardens while his aunt napped, discussing books in the library, arguing gently over poetry, she had come to believe that he saw her as more than simply an employee of the house. There had been moments, brief and unspoken, when his eyes lingered a little too long, when his voice softened in a way it did not soften for others. She had told herself she was imagining it, that a duke could never truly regard a woman of her modest standing as anything more than pleasant company. And yet the thought that he had stood there tonight, silent, while his cousin humiliated her, cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, low and threatening. Eleanor quickened her pace, though her thin slippers were already soaked through from the damp grass at the edge of the road, and blisters had begun to form against her heels. She thought of turning back, of finding some servant's entrance where she might beg for shelter until morning. But pride held her feet moving forward. She would not return to that house, not tonight, not after what had happened. The first drops of rain began to fall as she reached the crossroads a mile from the manor, where the road split three ways. One path leading toward the village, one toward the neighboring county, and one back the way she had come. She stood for a moment, uncertain, rain beginning to soak through her gown, when she heard the distant sound of hooves on the road behind her. Her heart leapt with a foolish, fragile hope. Perhaps someone had noticed, perhaps someone had come after her. But she quickly reminded herself that hope was a dangerous thing for a woman alone on a dark road, and she stepped back into the shadow of the hedgerow, watching as a single rider passed by without slowing, his horse's hooves throwing up mud as he continued down the road toward the village, oblivious to the woman hiding just feet away. It was not for her. Of course it was not for her. Eleanor pressed on, choosing the path toward Marlow Cross, though the rain had grown heavier now, soaking through to her skin, and the wind had picked up enough to make the trees along the road groan and sway. She thought of the small inn she had visited once with the Duke's aunt, the Bramwell house, run by a widow named Margaret Bramwell, a warm, no-nonsense woman who had once given Eleanor a cup of tea and a kind word during a long carriage journey. Perhaps, if she could reach the inn, she might find enough charity to survive the night, even if she could not pay for a room. The walk to the village felt endless. Her feet ached with every step, and more than once she stumbled on the uneven road, catching herself against the low stone walls that lined the way. She passed no other travelers, no carriages, no sign of another living soul, only the dark fields stretching out on either side, silent witnesses to her long and lonely walk. She thought, as she walked, of the years before Ashcombe, of the small cottage where she had grown up with her parents, of her father's quiet laugh and her mother's habit of humming while she worked. She thought of how quickly a comfortable life could be taken away, how a single illness, a single winter, could strip a family of everything it had built. She had learned early that the world offered little mercy to those without money or name, and she had built her composure carefully over the years, brick by brick, so that no one could ever again see how deeply such losses wounded her. Tonight, that composure was being tested more than it had been in a very long time, and still she refused to let it crack. A fox darted across the road ahead of her, startled by her footsteps, and Eleanor flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rain had soaked through every layer of her gown now, and she could feel the cold settling deep into her bones, a cold that frightened her more than the darkness or the empty road. She began to count her steps, a small trick she had used since childhood to keep her mind steady during difficult moments, counting the paces between one crooked fence post and the next, focusing on numbers instead of fear. By the time the first lights of Marlow Cross came into view, flickering weakly through the rain, Eleanor was shivering uncontrollably, her lips tinged blue, her gown clinging to her like a second skin. She did not know it yet, but behind her, back at Ashcombe Manor, the ballroom had fallen into a very different kind of chaos. For within the hour, Alexander, Duke of Ashcombe, had gone looking for her, expecting to find her resting quietly in her room as she often did after long evenings of entertaining his aunt's guests. When he found the room empty, her few belongings untouched, a maid finally worked up the courage to tell him what had happened in the ballroom while he had been occupied in conversation. The color drained from his face as the maid spoke. He asked no further questions. He did not wait to find his cousin, though his fury toward her was already rising like a storm of its own. He turned on his heel, strode through the manor with a speed that sent servants scattering from his path, and burst into the stable yard, where grooms were startled from their evening tasks by the sudden appearance of their master, soaked already from the rain, his face set with a grim determination none of them had ever seen before. "Every carriage," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Every rider, every horse in this stable. I want them on the roads within the quarter hour." The head groom hesitated only a moment before the look in the Duke's eyes convinced him not to ask a single question. Within minutes, the stable yard was alive with movement, carriages being readied, horses saddled, lanterns lit against the driving rain. Alexander mounted his own horse before the others were even finished with the harnesses, and rode out into the storm alone, calling Eleanor's name into the wind and rain, though the road stretched dark and empty in every direction, and somewhere out there, cold and shivering and utterly unaware, the woman he was searching for believed herself completely and entirely forgotten. Rain lashed against Alexander's face as he rode hard down the road toward the village, his horse's hooves throwing up sheets of muddy water with every stride. He had not stopped to grab a coat, and the cold had long since soaked through his shirt, but he did not notice it, not really. His mind was fixed entirely on the image of Eleanor walking alone into the storm, dismissed from the only home she had, humiliated in front of half the county, while he had stood across the room, too absorbed in idle conversation to notice what his own cousin was doing. He should have known something was wrong the moment he saw Margaret's satisfied expression earlier that evening. He had learned, over the years, to recognize the particular gleam in his cousin's eyes when she believed she had won some quiet victory, but he had dismissed it, too distracted by his guests, too trusting of a woman who had been part of his household since childhood. That trust, he now realized with a sick, twisting feeling in his stomach, had been badly misplaced. Behind him, the stable yard had emptied entirely. 3 carriages rattled down different roads, each carrying grooms and footmen with lanterns held high against the rain, searching every lane and crossroads within miles of the manor. Riders fanned out toward the neighboring villages, stopping at inns and farmhouses to ask if anyone had seen a young woman traveling alone, soaked and without a coat, in the storm. Alexander had given the order himself, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for hesitation among his staff, and every servant in the household understood, without being told directly, that something had gone very wrong that night, and that their master's fury was not something any of them wished to provoke further. Alexander reached the crossroads where Eleanor had stood uncertain only an hour before, and he reined in his horse, breathing hard, rain streaming down his face as he looked down each of the 3 paths in turn. There was no way to know which one she had taken. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think as she might have thought, trying to remember anything she had ever told him about the villages nearby, about places she might consider safe. Then he remembered. Months earlier, during a carriage journey with his aunt, they had stopped briefly at an inn in Marlow Cross, and Eleanor had spoken warmly of the innkeeper, a widow who had shown her unexpected kindness on a difficult day. It was a small detail, easily forgotten, but Alexander held on to it now like a lifeline. He turned his horse toward the village road and urged it forward into the rain. As he rode, his thoughts turned bitterly toward his cousin. Margaret had always resented the attention Alexander paid to those she considered beneath the family's notice, servants, companions, tenants who struggled to pay their rent. She had made her opinions known often enough over the years, though Alexander had never imagined she would go so far as to publicly humiliate someone under his protection, not without some deeper motive driving her. He thought again of the conversations he had overheard in recent weeks, fragments about inheritance, about the estate's future, about the pressing need for him to marry and secure the family line before certain provisions in his late father's will came into effect. Margaret had a great deal to gain if Alexander remained unmarried, and eventually the estate passed through a different branch of the family. He had never taken the thought seriously before. Now, riding through the storm in search of a woman his cousin had cruelly cast out, he could not stop turning it over in his mind. Before he had ridden far from the manor, Alexander had paused only once, at the edge of the drive, where his cousin Margaret stood watching the chaos in the stable yard with an expression that struck him as far too calm for the circumstances. He had reined in his horse just long enough to look down at her, rain streaming between them, and ask a single question. Why? Margaret had lifted her chin, unbothered by the storm soaking through her own shawl. She overstepped her position, Alexander. Surely you noticed the way she looked at you, the way she spoke to you as though she were your equal. I did the household a service tonight. You did nothing but cruelty, Alexander had answered, his voice low and cold in a way that made even Margaret take a small step back. And if any harm comes to her because of what you have done, you will answer for it, cousin or not. He had not waited for her reply, spurring his horse forward into the storm, leaving her standing alone in the rain with whatever thoughts occupied her calculating mind. The exchange stayed with him now as he rode, sharpening his resolve, reminding him that whatever else happened that night, he could no longer pretend that his cousin's ambitions were harmless. The ride to the village tested both horse and rider. Twice Alexander's mount stumbled on the uneven road, nearly throwing him into the mud, and twice he steadied the animal with a firm hand and pressed onward, unwilling to slow his pace even for a moment. He passed 2 of his own search parties along the way, footmen with lanterns held high, calling Eleanor's name into the hedgerows, and he shouted brief instructions to each of them before continuing on, determined to reach the village himself rather than wait idly for news. He arrived in Marlow Cross nearly an hour later, his horse exhausted, his own body soaked through and shivering, though he barely registered the discomfort. The village was quiet, most windows dark, the rain having driven everyone indoors long ago. He rode directly to the small inn at the edge of the village, recognizing it from his aunt's brief visit months before, and dismounted quickly, his boots splashing into the mud as he strode toward the door. The innkeeper, a stout woman with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, answered his knock with obvious surprise, taking in the sight of a soaked, wild-eyed nobleman standing on her doorstep in the middle of a storm. "Your Grace," she said, recognizing him at once, though her tone carried more caution than welcome. "It is a poor night to be traveling." "I am looking for a young woman," Alexander said, his voice rough with exhaustion and worry. "Eleanor Whitfield. She may have come this way tonight, on foot, without a coat. Please, if you know anything." The innkeeper's expression shifted, something guarded entering her eyes. And why would a duke be chasing after a dismissed companion through the rain at this hour? The question struck Alexander harder than he expected. He realized, standing there dripping on her doorstep, that word had already reached the village, carried perhaps by the very rider who had passed Eleanor on the road without stopping. The story of her dismissal, and likely a version far crueler than the truth, had traveled faster than he had. "Because it was a lie," Alexander said. "Because my cousin dismissed her out of spite, and I stood by like a fool and let it happen. And now she is somewhere out in this storm because of my failure to protect her. Please, I only wish to know if she is safe." Something in his voice, raw and unguarded in a way that rarely came naturally to men of his station, seemed to soften the innkeeper's suspicion. She studied him a moment longer before stepping back from the door. "She has not come here, Your Grace. But if she is walking from the manor, she would likely take the low road, the one that follows the river before it reaches the village. It floods quickly in weather like this." Alexander felt his stomach drop at the words. The low road was dangerous even in fair weather, narrow and close to the riverbank, with sections known to wash out during heavy rain. If Eleanor had taken that path, unaware of its dangers, she could be in far greater peril than simple exposure to the cold. He thanked the innkeeper hastily and was back on his horse within moments, riding hard toward the low road, his heart pounding with a fear sharper than anything he had felt in years. He shouted her name into the darkness as he rode, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the rain and the rush of the swollen river beside the path. But he did not stop calling, driven by a desperate hope that she might hear him, that she might answer, that he might find her safe before the night claimed something he was only now beginning to understand he could not bear to lose. The road grew narrower and more treacherous as he continued, the ground soft and uncertain beneath his horse's hooves, the river rushing loud and dark just beyond the low stone wall to his left. In several places, water had already begun spilling over the path, and Alexander was forced to slow his pace, scanning the darkness on either side for any sign of movement, any flash of pale blue fabric against the black and gray of the storm. He thought of every conversation he had shared with Eleanor over the past months, replaying them with a clarity that only regret could bring. The way she had laughed, quietly and without pretension, at something foolish he had said in the garden. The careful, thoughtful way she spoke about books, about the world, about the small injustices she noticed and quietly tried to correct wherever she could. He had told himself for months that his growing attachment to her was simply appreciation for a rare and intelligent companion, that a duke could not seriously consider a match with a woman of no fortune and no family name, no matter how deeply he admired her character. Riding through the storm, calling her name into the wind, he understood now how foolish that reasoning had been, how much of his own heart he had refused to acknowledge, simply because acknowledging it would have required courage he had not yet found. He would find that courage now, he told himself, if only the night would give him the chance. Behind him, one of his footmen, a steady young man named Walter who had served the household for years, caught up on horseback, his lantern swinging wildly with the pace of his ride. Walter had been among the first to reach the stable yard when the alarm was raised, and he had barely stopped since, riding first to the eastern farms and then doubling back toward the village road, when word reached him that the Duke had ridden this way alone. "Your Grace," Walter called, drawing his horse alongside Alexander's, "the carriages have found nothing on the northern road. Should I send word back to the manor?" "Not yet," Alexander answered, scanning the darkness ahead. "Stay with me. This road grows dangerous near the river, and I will not risk losing another lantern in the dark if I can help it." Walter nodded, falling into pace beside him, and the two men rode on together, their lanterns casting small, trembling circles of light against the rain-soaked hedgerows. Alexander found some small comfort in the company, though his mind remained fixed entirely on the road ahead, on every shadow that might, for one hopeful heartbeat, resolve itself into the shape of a woman in a pale blue gown. They passed a shepherd's hut, dark and empty, and an old stone bridge where the river narrowed before widening again toward the floodplain further along the path. Alexander called Eleanor's name at every turn, every gap in the hedges, every place a frightened, exhausted traveler might have taken shelter. Walter did the same, his younger voice carrying further into the wind, though neither man received any answer beyond the rush of water and the steady drumming of rain against the earth. Nearly a mile further along the low road, his horse suddenly balked, refusing to continue forward, and Alexander reined in sharply, peering into the darkness ahead. The river had risen higher here, water spilling across a full section of the path, and in the dim light of his lantern, he could see that a portion of the low stone wall had crumbled away entirely, swept into the rushing current below. His heart seized with dread. If Eleanor had reached this point in the darkness, unable to see the danger ahead, she might have walked directly into the flooding water without any warning at all. He dismounted quickly, holding his lantern high, searching the churning water and the muddy banks on either side for any sign of her, calling her name again and again into the storm, his voice growing hoarse, his fear growing with every passing silent moment that offered no answer at all. Walter joined him at the water's edge, holding his own lantern low against the current, searching for any sign of fabric or footprints along the muddy bank. "Your Grace, look here," he said suddenly, kneeling beside a patch of softened earth just before the washed-out section of the wall. Footprints, small ones, leading away from the water, not into it. Relief and fear tangled together in Alexander's chest as he crouched beside the prints, tracing their direction with his eyes. Whoever had made them, and he allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope that it was Eleanor, had turned away from the flooding path before reaching the dangerous section, cutting instead through a gap in the hedge that led toward a cluster of farm buildings visible faintly in the distance. It was not certainty. It was not safety. But it was, for the first time since he had ridden out into the storm, a direction, a thread of hope to follow into the darkness, and Alexander seized it without hesitation, calling for Walter to follow as he pushed through the gap in the hedge, his heart pounding with something that felt, for the first time all night, almost like hope. The farmhouse Eleanor had stumbled upon belonged to a widow named Grace Bramwell, no relation to the innkeeper in the village despite sharing a surname common enough in the county, a woman in her 50s who had lived alone on the small property since her husband's death some years before. Eleanor had seen the dim glow of a candle through a kitchen window as she cut across the fields, half blind with exhaustion and cold, and had knocked on the door with the last of her strength before her knees finally gave way beneath her. Grace had opened the door to find a young woman collapsed on her doorstep, soaked through and shivering violently, and had not hesitated for even a moment before pulling her inside, wrapping her in blankets, and setting a kettle over the fire. She asked no questions at first, understanding instinctively that the girl needed warmth and rest before anything else, and it was not until Eleanor had stopped shaking quite so badly, a cup of hot tea warming her hands, that Grace finally asked, gently, what had brought her walking alone through such a storm. Eleanor told her the truth, or most of it, leaving out the parts that felt too raw to speak aloud even to a stranger's kind face. She spoke of her dismissal, of Lady Margaret's cruel words in front of the assembled guests, of walking away rather than begging for a position she no longer wished to hold in a household that had shown her such contempt. She did not speak of Alexander, of the quiet hours in the garden, of the hope she had allowed herself to feel and now regretted feeling at all. Grace listened without interrupting, her weathered face carrying an expression of quiet understanding that suggested she had seen her own share of hardship over the years. When Eleanor finished, Grace simply nodded and rose to fetch a dry nightgown from her own modest collection of clothing. "You'll stay here tonight," Grace said, in a tone that left no room for argument. "The roads are no place for anyone in this weather, dismissed or not. We'll speak of what comes next in the morning, when you've had proper rest and a warm meal in you." Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist she could not impose on a stranger's kindness, but the truth was, she had nowhere else to go, and the exhaustion pulling at every part of her body made argument impossible. She accepted the dry clothing gratefully, and within the hour found herself tucked into a narrow bed in a small guest room, listening to the rain still hammering against the window panes, her mind circling endlessly around the events of the evening despite her body's desperate need for sleep. She thought again of Alexander's silence in the ballroom, the way he had not so much as glanced in her direction while his cousin destroyed her position and her reputation in a single breath. She told herself it should not surprise her, that she had always known the gulf between their stations was too wide to cross, that whatever warmth had grown between them during their quiet conversations had likely meant far less to him than it had come to mean to her. And yet the hurt of his silence sat heavier in her chest than the humiliation of the dismissal itself, heavier than the cold and the rain and the long, lonely walk through the storm. Eventually exhaustion won out over her racing thoughts, and Eleanor drifted into a fitful sleep, unaware that at that very moment, Less than a mile away, the Duke of Ashcombe was pushing through a gap in Grace Bramwell's hedge, following a set of small footprints through the mud with a desperation that had nothing left of the composed, distant nobleman he had appeared to be in the ballroom only hours before. Alexander and Walter reached the farmhouse just as the storm began, finally, to lessen its fury, the rain softening from a driving downpour to a steady, gentler fall. They approached the small stone building cautiously, and Alexander raised his hand to knock, his heart pounding with a hope he barely dared to trust, when the door opened before his knuckles ever touched the wood. Grace Bramwell stood in the doorway, a lantern raised in one hand, her expression sharpening with suspicion at the sight of two soaked, exhausted men standing on her doorstep in the middle of the night. "It is rather late for visitors," she said, her voice steady despite the hour. "Forgive the intrusion," Alexander said quickly. "I am searching for a young woman, Eleanor Whitfield. I believe she may have passed this way tonight, on foot, in this storm. Please, if you know anything of her whereabouts." Something shifted in Grace's expression at the mention of Eleanor's name, a flicker of recognition quickly masked by caution. "And who is asking?" "Alexander Ashworth, Duke of Ashcombe," he answered, and watched as the widow's eyes widened slightly, before narrowing again with fresh suspicion. "The very household that dismissed her tonight, if the girl's own account is to be believed," Grace said, her tone cooling considerably. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I find myself disinclined to hand a frightened young woman over to the family that cast her out into a storm." Alexander felt something in his chest tighten painfully at her words, at the clear implication that Eleanor believed herself entirely abandoned by him, that she had walked away from Ashcombe Manor convinced he had stood silently by while his cousin destroyed her position. He supposed, from where she had stood in that ballroom, that was exactly what it had looked like. "She is not wrong to think poorly of my household tonight," Alexander said quietly. "My cousin dismissed her out of jealousy and spite, using lies I only discovered after Eleanor had already gone. I did not know what was happening until it was far too late to stop it, and I have spent every moment since searching every road within miles for some sign of her safety. I do not ask you to hand her over, madam. I ask only to know that she is safe, and perhaps, if she is willing, to offer my apology in person." Grace studied him for a long moment, the lantern light flickering across her weathered face as she weighed his words against whatever instincts years of life had taught her about reading people's true intentions. Finally, something in her posture softened, though her caution did not disappear entirely. "She is asleep upstairs, warm and safe, and I will not wake her at this hour for anyone, Duke or otherwise," Grace said firmly. "But you may wait, if you wish, until morning. There is a barn with dry hay if you and your man care to shelter there, and I will see that she knows you came, when she wakes, and let her decide for herself whether she wishes to see you." It was not everything Alexander wanted, but it was, he understood, more than he had any right to expect, and far more mercy than his family had shown Eleanor that night. He thanked Grace sincerely, relief loosening the tight knot of fear that had gripped his chest since he first learned of Eleanor's dismissal, and he and Walter retreated to the small barn, where they settled into the dry hay to wait out the remaining hours of the night, both men soaked through and exhausted but unwilling to leave the property until they knew, with certainty, that Eleanor was truly safe. Sleep did not come easily to Alexander despite his exhaustion. He lay in the hay listening to the rain finally taper off entirely, his mind turning over every detail of the evening, every moment he might have acted differently, every sign of his cousin's scheming he had chosen to overlook because acknowledging it would have required confronting a truth he had not been ready to face. He thought of the letter Eleanor had once mentioned finding in the library desk, a fragment of information she had shared almost in passing during one of their garden conversations, describing a letter addressed to a solicitor that she had not had time to read fully before being interrupted. He had dismissed it at the time as unimportant household correspondence. Now, lying awake in a stranger's barn, he began to suspect it had been far more significant than either of them realized. Morning arrived gray and quiet, the storm having passed entirely, leaving the fields around the farmhouse soaked and glistening under a pale, watery sun. Eleanor woke slowly, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar room before the memories of the previous night came rushing back. She dressed in the borrowed nightgown and a simple day dress Grace had left for her, and made her way downstairs, where the smell of fresh bread greeted her along with the sight of Grace bustling about the small kitchen. "You're awake," Grace said, glancing up with a warm, if slightly cautious smile. "Sit, eat something. You'll need your strength for whatever the day brings." Eleanor accepted a cup of tea and a slice of warm bread gratefully, though her stomach tightened with unspoken worry about what the future held. She had no position, no immediate prospects, and precious little money to sustain herself while she searched for new employment. She was turning these worries over in her mind when Grace spoke again, her tone carefully casual in a way that immediately caught Eleanor's attention. "You had visitors last night, after you'd gone to sleep." Eleanor's cup paused halfway to her lips. "Visitors?" "The Duke of Ashcombe himself, and one of his footmen, half drowned from riding through the storm searching every road for you," Grace said, watching Eleanor's face carefully as she spoke. "He seemed rather beside himself with worry, if I'm any judge of such things. Claims his cousin acted alone, out of spite, and that he knew nothing of it until you'd already gone." Eleanor set down her cup with hands that had begun, very slightly, to tremble. Part of her wanted desperately to believe it, to believe that his silence in the ballroom had not been indifference after all, that he had truly been unaware of what his cousin was doing until it was too late. But another part of her, older and more guarded, warned against such easy hope, reminding her of every disappointment she had learned to expect from a world that rarely favored women in her position. "Where is he now?" Eleanor asked quietly. "In the barn last I checked, though I imagine neither he nor his man got much sleep," Grace said. "I told him I would let you decide whether you wish to see him. You're under no obligation, dear. Whatever happened between you and that household, you owe them nothing, Duke or not." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, staring into her tea as though it might offer some answer to the question churning inside her. She thought of the ballroom, of Alexander's turned back, of the long, cold walk through the storm that had followed. And she thought, too, of the quiet garden conversations, of his genuine laughter, of the careful way he had once listened to her opinions on matters most men of his station would never think to ask a companion about at all. She was not ready, not yet, to simply forgive and forget the pain of the previous night. But she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not ready to turn him away entirely either, not without hearing whatever explanation he had come so far, through such a storm, to offer. "I will see him," Eleanor said finally. "But Grace, I would ask that you remain nearby. I find I am not yet certain how much of what he says I am prepared to believe." Grace nodded approvingly, as though Eleanor had passed some quiet test of her own judgment, and rose to fetch Alexander from the barn, leaving Eleanor alone for one last moment to steady herself before facing the man whose silence had wounded her nearly as much as his cousin's cruel words. Alexander entered the small kitchen moments later, still in the same rain-soaked clothing from the night before, mud staining his boots and his hair falling loose across his forehead, in a way Eleanor had never once seen in all the months she had known him within the ordered walls of Ashcombe Manor. He looked, for the first time since she had met him, entirely unlike a duke, and entirely like a man who had spent the night in genuine fear for someone he cared about. "Eleanor," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name, quiet and raw, made her chest ache despite her determination to remain guarded. "I am so deeply sorry. For last night, for my silence, for every moment you spent alone in that storm believing yourself abandoned. You did not so much as look at me," Eleanor said, her voice steady, though the words carried the full weight of the hurt she had carried through the long walk in the rain. "Your cousin humiliated me in front of half the county, and you stood there as though nothing at all was happening." "I did not hear her until it was already done," Alexander said. "I was speaking with Lord Ferris about a matter of business, and by the time I turned around, you were already gone from the room. A maid told me what had happened perhaps 20 minutes later, and I have not stopped searching since. Eleanor, I swear to you, if I had known, if I had heard even a single word of what my cousin intended, I would have stopped it before it began." Eleanor studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of the practiced charm men of his station so often used to smooth over their failures, but she found instead only exhaustion and worry, and something that looked very much like genuine remorse. Still, she was not yet ready to surrender her hurt so easily. "And why," she asked quietly, "would your cousin go to such lengths to see me gone? A companion to your aunt hardly seems worth such elaborate cruelty." Alexander was silent for a moment, his jaw tightening as he considered the question. "I do not know the full truth of it yet," he admitted, "but I intend to find out, and I do not believe her motives were as simple as she claimed last night. There have been matters concerning the estate, concerning my father's will, that I have not paid close enough attention to these past months. I believe my cousin has interests in this house remaining exactly as it has always been, with no wife, no heir, no change to the current arrangement of things. I believe, Eleanor, that you may have become an obstacle to those interests, whether either of us intended it or not." The words settled uneasily over the small kitchen. And Eleanor found herself thinking again of the letter she had glimpsed in the library desk, the one addressed to a solicitor, the one she had never had the chance to read in full. She hesitated only a moment before deciding the matter was too important to withhold. "There was a letter," she said slowly, "in the library desk, perhaps a week ago. Your cousin's handwriting, addressed to a solicitor in London. I did not read enough of it to understand its meaning before I was interrupted, but I have wondered since whether it holds some answer to your question." Alexander's expression sharpened immediately, a flicker of something between anger and grim satisfaction crossing his features. "Then that is where I shall begin," he said. "Eleanor, I cannot undo what happened last night, and I do not expect you to simply forget the pain my household has caused you. But I ask that you allow me the chance to make this right, to uncover the truth of my cousin's scheme, and to see that your name is restored exactly as it deserves to be, publicly and without question." Eleanor considered his words carefully, aware of Grace watching quietly from the doorway, ready to intervene should the conversation take a turn she did not trust. She thought of the long walk through the storm, of the humiliation in the ballroom, of the fragile hope she had tried so hard to bury and had now, despite everything, found rekindled by the sight of a duke who had ridden through a storm all night rather than accept her disappearance. "I will allow it," Eleanor said finally, "though I make no promises beyond that, Your Grace. My trust was not so easily broken, and it will not be so easily restored either." "That is more than fair," Alexander said, and something like relief passed briefly across his tired features. "I will not disappoint you again, Eleanor. Whatever it takes, I intend to see the truth brought fully into the light." He did not stay long after that, understanding instinctively that Eleanor needed time and space to recover from the ordeal of the previous night, and that trust, once damaged, could not be repaired in a single conversation over tea in a stranger's kitchen. He arranged instead for a carriage to be sent for her later that day, offering her the choice of returning to the manor under her own terms, or remaining at Grace's farmhouse until she felt ready to decide her next steps. He and Walter rode away shortly after, leaving Eleanor alone once more with Grace, and with a great deal to consider about the tangled web of ambition and deceit that had, without her ever intending it, come to surround her ordinary, quiet life. Alexander returned to Ashcombe Manor with a purpose sharper than any he had carried in years. He bypassed the servants who rushed to attend him, ignoring their questions about his soaked clothing and haggard appearance, and strode directly to the library, where the desk Eleanor had mentioned stood exactly where it always had, beneath the tall windows overlooking the eastern garden. He searched the drawers methodically, his frustration mounting as the first several revealed nothing but ordinary household correspondence and receipts. It was not until he reached the bottom drawer, locked and requiring a small key he found hidden beneath a false panel at the back of the desk, that he discovered what he had been searching for. Inside lay a small bundle of letters, tied together with a ribbon, all written in Margaret's precise, elegant hand, addressed to a solicitor named Mr. Pembroke in London. Alexander untied the ribbon with hands that trembled slightly, whether from exhaustion or anger he could not entirely say, and began to read. The letters revealed a scheme more calculated than even his darkest suspicions had imagined. Margaret had been quietly investigating the provisions of his late father's will for months, uncovering a clause Alexander himself had never fully understood, one stating that should he remain unmarried past his 30th birthday, now less than a year away, a significant portion of the estate's unentailed property and income would pass not to Margaret directly, but to her son, currently studying abroad, effectively securing her branch of the family a permanent and substantial claim on the Ashcombe fortune, regardless of whom Alexander eventually chose to marry. Margaret had grown increasingly desperate as Alexander's 30th birthday approached without any sign of an engagement, and she had apparently begun to suspect, correctly as it turned out, that his growing attachment to Eleanor might result in a match that would secure his line permanently and eliminate any hope of her son inheriting anything at all. Rather than risk such an outcome, she had decided to remove Eleanor from the household entirely, hoping that with the companion gone, Alexander's attention would drift elsewhere, or that he would remain too preoccupied with his aunt's care and the estate's affairs to consider marriage before the deadline passed. The final letter in the bundle, dated only 3 days before the ball, made her intentions explicit in language that left no room for doubt. She had written to Pembroke asking whether any legal complications might arise from dismissing a household employee under fabricated pretenses, and whether such an action, if it drove the woman entirely from the county, might reasonably be expected to end whatever attachment had formed between her and the Duke. Alexander sat in stunned silence for several long minutes after finishing the letters, anger and something close to grief warring within him. He had known his cousin to be ambitious, even calculating at times, but he had never imagined she would go to such deliberate lengths, manipulating not only Eleanor's fate but his own future, all to protect an inheritance that was never rightfully hers to claim in the first place. He gathered the letters carefully and made his way to Margaret's rooms, finding her seated calmly at her writing desk, as though the previous night's events had not occurred at all. She looked up as he entered, and whatever composure she had maintained faltered slightly at the sight of the letters clutched in his hand. "I have read everything," Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Your correspondence with Pembroke. Your scheme to secure your son's inheritance by driving Eleanor from this house through lies and cruelty. I want to hear you deny it, Margaret, if you can find the courage to do so with these letters sitting between us." Margaret's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin with the same defiant pride Alexander remembered from her childhood, when she had always refused to admit fault even when caught entirely in the wrong. "I did what was necessary to protect this family's future," she said. "You have shown no interest in marriage for years, Alexander. I merely ensured that a woman of no fortune and no name could not distract you from your responsibilities to the estate and to the family line." "Her name is Eleanor," Alexander said, his voice rising for the first time. "And you humiliated her in front of half the county with a lie, forcing her out into a storm with nothing, all to protect an inheritance that belongs to you only through my continued unmarried state. Do you understand what could have happened to her last night, Margaret? Do you understand that she nearly walked directly into a flooding river because of your scheme?" Margaret's composure cracked slightly at this, a flicker of something like genuine concern passing across her features before she smoothed it away again. "I did not intend for her to come to any actual harm," she said. "I merely wished her gone from this household, and that distinction matters little to a woman who spent the night shivering in a stranger's farmhouse, wondering if she had any friends left in the world," Alexander said. "You will leave Ashcombe Manor by the end of the week, Margaret. I will see that you and your son are provided for, according to what my father's will actually entitles you. No more and no less, but you will no longer reside under this roof, and you will make no further attempt to interfere in my affairs, personal or otherwise." Margaret opened her mouth as though to argue further, but something in Alexander's expression, cold and utterly resolute in a way she had never seen from her cousin before, convinced her that further protest would only worsen her position. She nodded stiffly, her eyes glistening with what might have been anger or genuine regret, and said nothing more as Alexander turned and left her rooms. He did not yet know, standing alone in the corridor afterward with the damning letters still clutched in his hand, that Margaret's scheme reached far deeper than the bundle he had just uncovered, that a second, more dangerous plan was already in motion, one that would not simply fade away with a single confrontation, however righteous his anger. He believed, in that moment, that the worst of the danger had passed, that Eleanor's name would soon be restored, and his cousin's ambitions properly contained. It would take Charlotte Pembroke's unexpected arrival at Grace's farmhouse, still hours away, to reveal just how mistaken that belief truly was. Word of Margaret's scheme spread quickly through the household staff, and by the following morning, whispers of the true circumstances behind Eleanor's dismissal had begun reaching the wider county as well, carried by servants who had no particular loyalty to Margaret, and considerable sympathy for the young companion who had always treated them with kindness and respect. The story shifted rapidly from one of a disgraced companion cast out for improper conduct to one of a cruel and calculating relative attempting to manipulate a duke's future for her own financial gain, and public opinion, fickle as it often was, began turning sharply in Eleanor's favor. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained at Grace's farmhouse for several days, using the quiet time to consider her options carefully. A letter arrived from a distant acquaintance of her late mother, a Mrs. Caroline Fenwick, offering Eleanor a position as governess to her 3 children in a neighboring county, a respectable and secure situation that would remove her entirely from the complicated tangle of feelings and scandal surrounding Ashcombe Manor. The offer arrived at precisely the moment when Eleanor felt most uncertain about her future, and she found herself seriously considering it, weighing the safety and simplicity of a fresh start against the confusing pull she still felt toward Alexander despite everything that had happened. She had received no further word from him since his visit the morning after the storm, though Grace mentioned that riders had passed by occasionally, apparently keeping a discreet watch to ensure her continued safety without intruding directly on her privacy. Eleanor appreciated the gesture, though it did little to ease the uncertainty churning within her about what, if anything, might follow between them once the immediate crisis of Margaret's scheme had been resolved. She was seated at Grace's kitchen table, the governess' offer spread before her alongside a half-finished cup of tea, when a carriage arrived unexpectedly in the farmhouse's small yard. Eleanor rose to look out the window, expecting perhaps another of Alexander's discreet riders, and was surprised instead to see a finely dressed young woman step down from the carriage, her expression carrying an urgency that suggested she had traveled some distance in considerable haste. Grace answered the door before Eleanor could gather her thoughts, and returned moments later with the visitor in tow. A woman Eleanor did not recognize at first, though something about her features struck a faint chord of familiarity. "Miss Whitfield," the woman said, extending her hand with a warmth that immediately eased some of Eleanor's initial wariness. "Forgive my sudden intrusion. My name is Charlotte Pembroke. My father is the solicitor Lady Margaret has been corresponding with these past months, and I fear I have some rather urgent information you and the Duke both deserve to know." Eleanor's heart quickened at the mention of the solicitor's name, and she gestured Charlotte toward a chair, her mind already racing ahead to what further revelations this unexpected visitor might bring to a story that had already upended her entire life in the span of a single, storm-soaked night. "My father has grown increasingly uneasy about Lady Margaret's requests these past weeks," Charlotte continued once seated, accepting the cup of tea Grace offered with a grateful nod. "He has always conducted his affairs with strict discretion, but Lady Margaret's latest instructions troubled him deeply enough that he confided in me, hoping I might find some way to warn those affected before matters grew any worse." "What instructions?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with apprehension. Charlotte's expression grew grave. "She has instructed my father to draft a formal petition, Miss Whitfield, challenging the legitimacy of the Duke's guardianship over certain estate matters, using your presence in the household and your dismissal as evidence of what she intends to characterize as improper conduct, unbecoming a peer of the realm. She means to use the scandal she herself created to argue that the Duke is unfit to manage his own affairs, opening the door for her son's interests to be secured through legal intervention, rather than simply waiting for the deadline in your father's will to pass unmet." Eleanor sat back in her chair, stunned by the sheer audacity of the scheme unfolding before her. Margaret's dismissal of her the previous night, it seemed, had been only the opening move in a far larger and more calculated campaign, one that threatened not only Eleanor's reputation, but Alexander's entire authority over his own estate and household. Charlotte nodded, relief evident on her face at having successfully delivered her warning. "There is one more matter, Miss Whitfield, that my father asked me to convey, though he was reluctant to put it in writing given the sensitivity involved. Lady Margaret has arranged to meet privately with a second solicitor, a man of considerably less scruple than my father, in the town of Reading 3 days from now. My father believes she intends to sign documents formalizing the petition before the Duke has any opportunity to intervene or contest her claims. If the papers are filed before he is even aware of them, undoing the damage may prove far more difficult, even once her deception regarding your dismissal is fully exposed." 3 days, Eleanor repeated, her mind already calculating the distance to Reading and the time it would take word to reach Alexander and for him to act upon it. "Charlotte, why would your father risk so much to warn us? Surely such a warning could cost him Lady Margaret's business, perhaps far worse." Charlotte's expression softened, though a shadow of old sorrow passed briefly across her features. "My father lost his own sister many years ago to a scheme not unlike this one, a woman driven from her home by false accusations, engineered by relatives eager to claim her inheritance. He has never forgotten the helplessness of watching justice fail someone he loved, and he told me plainly that he would rather lose every client in London than stand silently by while history repeated itself in his own correspondence." The words settled heavily in the small kitchen, and Eleanor felt a fresh wave of gratitude toward this stranger who had traveled so far, at considerable personal risk, simply to ensure the truth reached those who needed it most. She thanked Charlotte sincerely, promising to see that her father's discretion would never be traced back to its source, and the two women spoke for a while longer, Charlotte offering what additional details she knew of the scheme's timeline and the identity of the second solicitor involved. Grace, listening quietly from near the hearth throughout the conversation, finally spoke up as Charlotte rose to take her leave. "You'll want to move quickly, dear," she said to Eleanor, already moving toward the small cabinet where she kept her few valuables. Retrieving a small purse of coins she pressed firmly into Eleanor's hands despite her protests. "For the journey, I'll have no arguments about it. You've a Duke to warn and precious little time to do it in." Eleanor accepted the coins gratefully, embracing Grace warmly, before following Charlotte out to the waiting carriage, her mind already turning over how best to explain the urgency of the situation once she reached Ashcombe Manor. The governess offer from Mrs. Fenwick sat forgotten on the kitchen table, its careful, safe promise of a quiet new life suddenly overshadowed entirely by the far more pressing matter of preventing Margaret's scheme from succeeding. He must be told immediately, Eleanor said, rising quickly from her chair despite the exhaustion still lingering in her limbs from the previous night's ordeal. Grace, might I trouble you for the use of your carriage? I believe it is time I returned to Ashcombe Manor after all. The carriage carrying Eleanor and Charlotte reached Ashcombe Manor just as the afternoon light began to soften into early evening, the storm from 2 nights before having given way to clear skies that seemed almost mocking in their calm indifference to the chaos still unfolding within the household. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage with a steadier composure than she had managed the last time she left through those very gates, though her heart still raced with the urgency of the news she carried. A footman recognized her immediately and hurried to fetch Alexander, who emerged from the study moments later, his expression shifting rapidly from surprise to concern at the sight of Eleanor's determined face and the unfamiliar young woman accompanying her. "Eleanor," he said, crossing the entrance hall quickly. "I did not expect. Is something wrong?" "We must speak privately," Eleanor said. "This is Charlotte Pembroke, daughter of the solicitor your cousin has been corresponding with. She has traveled a considerable distance to warn us both of a matter far more urgent than I believe you yet understand." Alexander's expression darkened, and he led them quickly into the study, closing the door firmly behind them before turning his full attention to Charlotte, who repeated the account she had already shared with Eleanor, describing Margaret's planned petition and the meeting arranged in Reading only 2 days hence. "She means to challenge my fitness to manage my own estate," Alexander said slowly, his voice tight with a fresh wave of fury as the full implications settled over him. "Using Eleanor's dismissal, which she herself engineered, as evidence against me. It is almost admirable in its audacity." "There is little time to waste admiring it, Your Grace," Charlotte said pointedly. "If the petition is filed before you can properly contest it, my father believes the legal process alone could tie up the estate's affairs for months, regardless of how quickly the truth of Lady Margaret's deception becomes known publicly." Alexander paced the length of the study, his mind working quickly through the tangle of legal and social complications now facing him. "I will need to travel to Reading myself, to confront this second solicitor directly and ensure no documents are signed before the truth is properly presented. Charlotte, would your father be willing to testify formally to what he has witnessed of your cousin's correspondence, if it comes to that?" "I believe he would, Your Grace, though it would come at some professional cost to him," Charlotte said. "He asked me to convey that he is prepared to bear that cost, if it means preventing further harm to those Lady Margaret has already wronged." Alexander nodded, gratitude and determination mingling in his expression, and turned to make immediate arrangements for the journey. It was then that Eleanor spoke up, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering beneath her composed exterior. "I wish to come with you," she said. Alexander turned to face her fully, surprise evident in his features. "Eleanor, the journey will be difficult, and Margaret's second solicitor may prove considerably less scrupulous than the man we can trust here. I would not wish to place you in any further danger, not after everything you have already endured because of my family's scheming." "I have already endured a great deal because of your family's scheming," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised even herself. "And I find I have no wish to sit quietly at a distance, waiting to learn whether my name and reputation will be restored or dragged further through scandal, by decisions made entirely without my presence. If this matter concerns me as directly as it does, Your Grace, I believe I have earned the right to be present when it is resolved." Something shifted in Alexander's expression at her words, a mixture of respect and something warmer he did not quite manage to hide. "You are right," he said finally. "Forgive me for assuming otherwise. Of course you shall come, if that is truly your wish." The journey to Reading was arranged for the following morning, and Eleanor spent that evening at the manor for the first time since her dismissal, the household staff greeting her with a warmth and deference that made clear how quickly and thoroughly Margaret's version of events had been overturned by the truth now circulating among them. She slept that night in a guest room, rather than her old quarters near the servants' hall, a small but pointed gesture from Alexander that Eleanor understood, without either of them needing to say it aloud, as a quiet acknowledgement that her position within the household, and within his life, had shifted into something neither of them had yet found the words to properly name. The carriage ride to Reading the following day passed largely in tense silence, both Eleanor and Alexander preoccupied with thoughts of the confrontation ahead. It was somewhere past the midpoint of the journey, the countryside rolling past in shades of green and gold beneath a clear autumn sky, that Alexander finally broke the silence between them. "I have thought a great deal these past days," he said, "about everything that happened, and everything I failed to see before it was nearly too late. I owe you a far more complete explanation than I gave you in Grace's kitchen, Eleanor, if you are willing to hear it." Eleanor turned to face him fully, something in his tone suggesting this conversation carried weight beyond simple apology. "I am listening. I have known, for longer than I have been willing to admit even to myself, that my feelings toward you extend well beyond simple appreciation for pleasant company," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident beneath it. "I told myself for months that such feelings were inappropriate, that a duke could not seriously consider attachment to a woman without fortune or family name, that indulging such thoughts would only complicate both our lives unnecessarily. I was a coward, Eleanor, hiding behind the expectations of my station rather than acknowledging what had grown between us honestly. And my cowardice very nearly cost you everything, because I was too afraid to make my regard known, too afraid to protect you openly as I should have from the very beginning." Eleanor's breath caught at his words, the careful composure she had maintained since her dismissal, wavering under the weight of a confession she had, in her most private moments, hoped for without ever truly believing she would hear it spoken aloud. "I walked away from that ballroom believing myself entirely forgotten," Eleanor said quietly, "believing that whatever I imagined had grown between us existed only in my own foolish hopes, and that you had simply been kind to me, the way any decent employer might be kind to a companion who served his family well. It was not until Grace told me you had ridden through the storm searching for me that I allowed myself to consider I might have been wrong." "You were entirely wrong," Alexander said, reaching across the carriage to take her hand gently, giving her every opportunity to withdraw it if she wished. "She did not. I searched every road within miles that night, not out of simple obligation to a former employee, Eleanor, but because the thought of losing you, of you disappearing from my life entirely because of my own silence and cowardice, was more than I could bear to consider. I love you. I should have found the courage to say so months ago, in the garden, in the library, in any of the countless moments we shared before my cousin's cruelty forced my hand, but I am saying it now, and I mean it with everything I am." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, though she found herself smiling despite them, the fragile hope she had carried since that first night finally blossoming into something she no longer needed to guard so carefully against disappointment. "I have loved you for longer than I dared admit as well," she said softly, "though I confess I had begun to convince myself it would be easier to accept the governess position and build a quiet life far from Ashcombe, rather than continue hoping for something I feared could never truly be mine. And now?" Alexander asked, hope evident in his voice despite the uncertainty still shadowing his expression. "Now," Eleanor said, "I find I would rather face whatever difficulties lie ahead, reading and your cousin's scheming included, than spend a single day pretending my heart belongs anywhere but here." The remainder of the journey passed in a warmth neither of them had expected to find amid such urgent and troubling circumstances, though both understood the confrontation awaiting them in Reading demanded their full attention and composure. They arrived at the solicitor's office shortly before the appointed meeting time, and Alexander wasted no time presenting himself and the bundle of letters to the startled clerk, insisting on speaking directly with the solicitor before any documents could be signed or filed. The solicitor, a nervous, weaselly man named Mr. Grimshaw, attempted at first to deny any knowledge of impropriety, but the sight of Margaret's own letters, combined with Alexander's clear authority and evident fury, quickly dismantled whatever thin defense he had prepared. He confessed readily enough, once pressed, that Margaret had offered him a substantial sum to draft and file the petition quickly, with minimal scrutiny of its questionable legal foundations, and that he had agreed primarily out of financial desperation rather than any genuine belief in the merits of her claims. Margaret herself arrived at the office only minutes later, evidently unaware that her plans had already unraveled entirely, and the color drained visibly from her face at the sight of Alexander and Eleanor, standing together in Grimshaw's small waiting room, the bundle of incriminating letters resting plainly on the desk between them. "Alexander," she said, her voice carrying a brittle attempt at composure that fooled no one present, "this is a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding remaining, Margaret," Alexander said, his voice cold and final. "I have your letters. I have Mr. Grimshaw's confession, and I have Eleanor, standing beside me exactly where she belongs, entirely unmoved by whatever scheme you hoped might separate us permanently. Your petition will not be filed. Your claims against my fitness to manage this estate will not be pursued. And your presence at Ashcombe Manor will end, as I already informed you, by the end of this week." Margaret's composure finally cracked entirely, years of carefully maintained pride giving way to something rawer and more desperate. "You would truly cast aside your own family for her sake?" she demanded, gesturing sharply toward Eleanor. "A companion with no fortune, no name worth mentioning, over blood relation and obligation? I would cast aside a family member who deliberately endangered an innocent woman's safety and reputation, for the sake of protecting her own inheritance, yes. Alexander answered without hesitation. You made your choices, Margaret. I am simply ensuring you bear the consequences of them, as any of us must when we choose cruelty over honesty. Eleanor, who had remained quiet through much of the confrontation, allowing Alexander to address his cousin's accusations directly, finally stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable strength that made even Margaret pause. You called me nothing worth mentioning, Lady Margaret, and perhaps by the measure of fortune and title you are correct. But I have spent 3 years caring for a household that was never mine, showing kindness to a woman who often forgot my name entirely, and asking for nothing beyond fair treatment in return. You dismissed me with a lie because you feared what my presence might mean for your own ambitions, and in doing so, you revealed far more about your own character than anything you could have said about mine. I do not need your approval, nor your family name, to know my own worth. Margaret's jaw tightened, color rising to her cheeks at being addressed so directly by a woman she had spent months dismissing as beneath her notice. Fine words, she said bitterly, for a woman who will still, in the end, depend entirely on my cousin's generosity for whatever position she comes to hold. Perhaps, Eleanor answered evenly, though I would rather depend on the generosity of a man who rode through a storm to find me, than on the false security of a household built upon lies and manipulation, as yours has been these past months. She let the words settle before continuing, her tone softening only slightly. I bear you no wish for further misfortune, Lady Margaret. I hope, in time, you find some path that does not require the ruin of others to secure your own comfort. Margaret said nothing further, though something in her expression suggested Eleanor's final words, however measured, had struck deeper than any of Alexander's earlier fury. She gathered what remained of her composure and turned toward the door, pausing only once to glance back at the pair standing united against her, before finally departing the solicitor's office without another word. Grimshaw, who had watched the entire exchange with the pale, anxious expression of a man calculating exactly how much trouble he now faced, cleared his throat nervously once the door had closed behind Margaret. Your Grace, I assure you, I had no true understanding of the full extent of Lady Margaret's intentions. I was simply willing to draft fraudulent legal claims against a peer's fitness to manage his own affairs, in exchange for payment, without troubling yourself over whether those claims held any genuine merit. Alexander finished for him, his tone leaving no doubt as to how little sympathy he held for the man's excuses. I do not intend to pursue formal charges against you today, Mr. Grimshaw, provided you cooperate fully and immediately in confirming, in writing, the full nature of Lady Margaret's instructions and payments to you. Should I discover any further attempt at deception on your part, that leniency will end immediately. Charlotte, who had waited quietly in the carriage throughout the confrontation, greeted them with visible relief as they finally emerged from the solicitor's office. It is done, then? She asked, searching their faces for confirmation. It is done, Alexander confirmed, allowing himself, for the first time in days, a genuine smile. Your father's courage in coming forward has spared this family a great deal of unnecessary suffering, Miss Pembroke, and I intend to see that his discretion in this matter is properly and generously rewarded, whatever the cost to my cousin's remaining pride. Charlotte flushed slightly at the praise, though her expression carried clear satisfaction at having played her own small part in seeing justice properly served. My father will be relieved beyond words to hear it, Your Grace. He has worried a great deal these past days over what consequences his warning might bring. Tell him he need worry no longer, Eleanor said warmly. Whatever debt exists between our households and his, it is one of gratitude, not grievance. As their carriage began the journey back toward Ashcombe, Eleanor found herself gazing out at the passing countryside with a lightness she had not felt in days, the accumulated weight of dismissal, storm, and scheming finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. Alexander, seated beside her, seemed similarly transformed, the guarded exhaustion of the previous days giving way to something closer to quiet contentment. There is still the matter of restoring your name properly before the wider county, Alexander said after some time, his tone thoughtful. Whispers and second-hand accounts will only carry a truth so far, Eleanor. I intend to see the matter settled publicly, and beyond any doubt, in a manner that leaves no question of your character or conduct unanswered. And how do you propose to manage that, Your Grace? Eleanor asked, curiosity coloring her voice. Alexander's expression turned faintly mischievous, a rare enough sight that Eleanor found herself smiling in response before he had even answered. I believe, he said, that Ashcombe Manor is rather overdue for another ball. Grimshaw agreed with obvious relief. hastily producing paper and ink to draft the requested confirmation, while Alexander and Eleanor waited, the tension of the confrontation slowly easing from both their shoulders as the paperwork was completed and signed. By the time they finally left the solicitor's office, the document securely in Alexander's possession, Margaret's scheme thoroughly exposed and her future at Ashcombe Manor conclusively ended, the worst of the danger to both Eleanor's reputation and Alexander's authority over his own estate had been permanently dismantled. Alexander offered Eleanor his arm as they stepped out into the clear afternoon light, both of them carrying the mingled exhaustion and relief of a battle finally, decisively won. Preparations for the second ball at Ashcombe Manor began almost immediately upon their return, though this occasion carried a very different purpose than the fateful evening that had begun Eleanor's ordeal. Alexander insisted on inviting every guest who had witnessed her humiliation weeks before, ensuring that the same eyes that had seen her dismissed with such casual cruelty would now witness her true standing, restored in full, public, and unmistakable fashion. Eleanor found herself both nervous and strangely eager as the day approached, aware that this gathering would mark the final, decisive chapter in a story that had upended her entire life within the span of a single stormy night. She spent the intervening days settling more fully into the manor, growing closer to Alexander with each passing evening, their conversations in the garden and library now carrying an openness neither of them had allowed themselves before, unburdened by the careful restraint they had both maintained while uncertain of the other's true feelings. News of Margaret's departure from the household spread quickly through the county, along with increasingly detailed accounts of the scheme she had orchestrated, softened somewhat in the retelling but leaving little doubt among those who heard it that Eleanor had been the wronged party throughout. Several of the more prominent families who had witnessed the original dismissal sent quiet notes of apology or concern in the days that followed, eager, Eleanor suspected, to align themselves favorably with whatever new arrangement seemed to be forming between the Duke and his former companion. Grace Bramwell received a personal invitation to the ball as well, along with a generous gift from Alexander in gratitude for the kindness and shelter she had offered Eleanor during the darkest hours of that first storm-soaked night. Grace accepted with characteristic bluntness, informing Eleanor during a visit to the manor that she had never in her life expected to attend a Duke's ball, and did not intend to let the opportunity pass without thoroughly enjoying herself. Charlotte Pembroke, too, received an invitation, along with her father, whose quiet courage in coming forward had proven instrumental in unraveling Margaret's scheme before it could cause any lasting damage. Alexander made a point of publicly thanking Mr. Pembroke during the preparations, ensuring that word of his integrity spread as thoroughly through London's professional circles as Margaret's disgrace had spread through the county's social ones. The evening of the ball arrived clear and cool, the manor's windows glowing warmly against the early autumn darkness, as carriages began arriving along the same gravel drive Eleanor had walked away from weeks before, soaked and humiliated, believing her connection to this house entirely severed. She stood now in a gown of deep emerald silk, a gift from Alexander that she had initially protested accepting before recognizing the gesture for what it truly was, not charity, but a genuine desire to see her arrive at this evening as an equal rather than a dependent. Alexander met her at the top of the grand staircase as guests began filling the ballroom below, his expression carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with performance for the assembled crowd, and everything to do with genuine admiration. "You look every bit as remarkable as this evening deserves," he said quietly, offering his arm. "I confess I feel rather more nervous than remarkable," Eleanor admitted, though she accepted his arm gratefully, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. "You have faced considerably more frightening things than a ballroom full of gossiping nobility these past weeks," Alexander said with a faint smile. "I have every confidence you shall manage this evening admirably as well." They descended the staircase together, and Eleanor felt the room's attention shift toward them immediately, conversations pausing as guests took in the sight of the Duke of Ashcombe escorting, with evident pride and affection, the very woman his cousin had so publicly dismissed weeks before. Whispers rippled through the assembled crowd, though Eleanor found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that she no longer felt the same crushing vulnerability that had accompanied Margaret's cruel words on that first fateful evening. She had survived a storm, both literal and figurative, and emerged from it with her dignity, and now her happiness, fully intact. Alexander called for the room's attention shortly after the first dances had concluded, his voice carrying easily across the crowded ballroom as he stood beside Eleanor near the grand fireplace, the same room where she had once been so cruelly cast out now serving as the stage for her complete and public vindication. "Many of you were present some weeks ago," Alexander began, "when a grave injustice occurred within these very walls. Miss Eleanor Whitfield was dismissed from this household on false pretenses, humiliated before this same company, through a deliberate scheme orchestrated by my cousin, Lady Margaret Colville, who sought to protect her own financial interests through cruelty and deception. I stood silent that evening, unaware of what was transpiring until it was nearly too late, and I have spent every day since working to correct both the immediate harm done to Miss Whitfield and my own failure to protect her as I should have. A murmur ran through the crowd, guests exchanging glances as the Duke's words confirmed the increasingly detailed rumors that had circulated through the county in recent weeks. It was at that very moment that a commotion arose near the entrance to the ballroom, and Eleanor turned, along with much of the assembled company, to see Margaret standing in the doorway, still dressed in traveling clothes, her expression a mixture of desperation and defiance, as two footmen moved to intercept her. "Let her through," Alexander said, his voice carrying a calm authority that silenced the ballroom's growing murmur entirely. The footman stepped aside, and Margaret strode forward several paces before stopping at the edge of the gathered crowd, her eyes fixed on her cousin with an intensity that suggested she had not traveled this distance merely to watch quietly from the shadows. "I heard you intended to make some grand announcement this evening," Margaret said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest guests, though she seemed to have lost, in this moment, whatever careful composure had once made her scheming so effective. "I could not simply stay away and allow you to paint me as the sole villain of this story, Alexander, when you know full well I acted only to protect a family legacy you yourself have shown little enough concern for these past years." A ripple of scandalized whispers spread through the ballroom at her words, and Eleanor felt her heart quicken, uncertain what further disruption Margaret might attempt on this most important of evenings. But Alexander's expression remained steady, unmoved by his cousin's desperate final gambit. "You are welcome to speak, Margaret, before every witness gathered here tonight," he said evenly. "Tell them plainly if you wish, exactly what you did, and why, and let them judge for themselves whether protecting a legacy justified the cruelty you inflicted on an innocent woman who had done nothing but serve this family faithfully for 3 years. Margaret opened her mouth as though to continue her protest, but the weight of dozens of watching eyes and the plain, damning truth of Alexander's challenge seemed finally to strip away whatever resolve had carried her through the door. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost much of its earlier defiance. "I only wished to secure my son's future," she said quietly, the fight draining visibly from her posture. "I see now that the cost was far greater than I allowed myself to consider at the time." "Then perhaps," Eleanor said gently, stepping forward before Alexander could respond, surprising both him and the watching crowd with her willingness to address Margaret directly in this moment, "you might spend whatever years remain to you, finding a way to secure his future through honesty rather than deception. I hold no wish to see you further humiliated tonight, Lady Margaret, whatever wrongs have passed between us. But this house, and this family, deserve better than the scheming that brought you here weeks ago, and I believe, in your own way, you already understand that." The ballroom remained silent, watching as Margaret studied Eleanor for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her features before she finally gave a small, stiff nod, and withdrew without further protest, disappearing back through the doorway and out into the night, leaving behind a silence that gradually gave way to a fresh wave of murmured astonishment at the grace Eleanor had shown even toward the woman who had once tried to destroy her. Alexander continued, his voice growing steadier and more resolute as he spoke. "Lady Margaret's scheme has been fully uncovered and addressed. She no longer resides at Ashcombe Manor, and her attempts to manipulate both Miss Whitfield's reputation and my own authority over this estate have been thoroughly and permanently dismantled. I wish this evening to serve as clear and public acknowledgement of the truth that Miss Whitfield's character and conduct throughout her time in this household, and throughout the difficult weeks that followed her dismissal, have been beyond reproach in every possible respect." He turned to face Eleanor directly then, and something in his expression shifted from formal address into something far more personal, the assembled crowd falling into an even deeper hush as they sensed the evening's true purpose finally emerging. "Eleanor," Alexander said, his voice softening, though it still carried clearly through the silent ballroom, "you walked out of this house weeks ago believing yourself entirely alone in the world, and I have spent every day since working to prove to you that such a belief was never true, and never shall be again. I do not simply wish to restore your reputation this evening. I wish to ask, before every person who witnessed your unjust dismissal, whether you would do me the very great honor of becoming my wife." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom, followed almost immediately by a rising murmur of surprised approval, several guests already smiling with evident delight at the unexpected turn the evening had taken. Eleanor felt her eyes fill with tears, though she made no effort to hide them, too overcome by the moment to maintain the careful composure she had relied upon throughout so much of the ordeal. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough that the nearest guests could hear it plainly, and the words seemed to ripple outward through the crowd, like a stone dropped into still water, sparking applause and delighted exclamations throughout the ballroom. "Yes, Alexander, I would be honored beyond anything I could have imagined." Alexander's smile in that moment held nothing of the careful, measured composure expected of a duke in public. Only pure, unguarded joy as he drew Eleanor into an embrace the entire ballroom witnessed and celebrated. The musicians, sensing the moment's significance, began playing once more, and the ball resumed around them with a warmth and genuine celebration that stood in stark, deliberate contrast to the cold cruelty of the evening weeks before. Grace Bramwell, watching from near the refreshment table with tears of her own gathering in her eyes, raised a glass toward the newly engaged couple with evident satisfaction, while Charlotte Pembroke stood beside her father, both of them exchanging a quiet, knowing smile at having played their own small but crucial part in bringing about such a happy resolution. Among those who approached was Lord Ferrus, the very gentleman whose conversation had distracted Alexander on the night of Eleanor's original dismissal. He bowed rather stiffly, evident discomfort in his expression as he addressed her directly for the first time. "Miss Whitfield, I owe you a debt of apology I have delayed far too long in offering," he said. "Had I not kept the Duke so occupied that evening with matters of considerably less importance than I believed at the time, he might have intervened before Lady Margaret's cruelty ever reached its conclusion. I am deeply sorry for my unwitting part in your suffering." "You could not have known what was unfolding elsewhere in the room, Lord Ferrus," Eleanor said kindly, though she appreciated the sincerity of his apology. "I hold no grievance against you. If anything, I have come to understand that evening as simply one more piece of a scheme, far more calculated than any of us realized at the time." Lord Ferrus seemed visibly relieved by her gracious response, and moved on to offer his congratulations to Alexander in turn, leaving Eleanor to continue receiving well wishes from a steady stream of guests, eager to align themselves with the newly celebrated couple. Mrs. Fenwick, whose governess position Eleanor had so nearly accepted, approached as well, offering warm congratulations of her own, alongside a knowing smile. "I confess I suspected, when I sent that offer, that you might never actually need it," Mrs. Fenwick said. "Something in Grace Bramwell's letter, describing your circumstances, suggested a story that was far from finished unfolding. I am glad to see I was right, Miss Whitfield, and gladder still to see you so happily settled." As the evening continued, guest after guest approached Eleanor with warm congratulations, several offering quiet apologies for their earlier silence or gossip regarding her dismissal, apologies Eleanor accepted graciously, understanding that the truth had ultimately spoken far louder than any rumor or scheme designed to obscure it. She danced with Alexander beneath the same chandeliers that had witnessed her humiliation weeks before, the light now feeling warm and celebratory rather than harsh and exposing, and found herself thinking, with quiet gratitude, of the strange and difficult path that had led her from that cold, rain-soaked road to this moment of complete and public vindication. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, Alexander drew Eleanor aside for a quiet moment near the same garden doors where they had once shared so many careful, guarded conversations before either of them found the courage to speak their true feelings aloud. "I owe you an apology I have not yet properly given," Alexander said quietly, his hand finding hers in the cool evening air drifting through the open doors. "Not simply for my silence that first night, but for every month before it, when I allowed fear of scandal and expectation to keep me from telling you plainly what I felt. You deserved honesty from me long before circumstances forced it into the open. You have more than made up for that silence these past weeks," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand gently. "I do not need to dwell on what was lost, Alexander. Not when what lies ahead promises so much more than either of us dared imagine only a short time ago." He smiled at that, drawing her closer as the sounds of music and celebration continued behind them. "Then let us dwell only on what comes next," he said, "and leave the storms of the past exactly where they belong." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, watching the last of the evening's guests continue their celebration within the warmly lit ballroom, and felt, for the first time since that cold and frightening night weeks before, entirely and completely at peace. She thought back, briefly, to the long walk through the storm, to the ache in her feet and the cold that had settled so deeply into her bones, to the despair she had felt believing herself utterly alone in the world with nothing left to her name. It seemed almost impossible now, standing in this warm and celebratory ballroom with Alexander's hand in hers, that such despair had ever felt so complete and unshakable. And yet she understood, with a clarity that only such hardship could have taught her, that the woman who had walked away from Ashcombe Manor that night, refusing to beg, refusing to let her dignity crumble even in the face of public humiliation, was the very same woman who now stood here, ready to become its future duchess. The storm had not broken her. It had, in its own harsh and unexpected way, revealed exactly the strength she had always carried within her, long before any duke had ridden through the rain to find her. "What are you thinking of?" Alexander asked softly, noticing the faraway look in her eyes. "Of curtsies," Eleanor said, smiling faintly, "and of how much can change between one and the next, if only we are brave enough to see it through." Alexander laughed quietly at that, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, as the music continued behind them. "Then let us make certain," he said, "that every curtsy from this evening forward is met with nothing less than the welcome you have always deserved." The woman who had once curtsied and walked alone into a storm, believing herself forgotten and dismissed, now stood as the future Duchess of Ashcombe, her name restored, her worth publicly acknowledged, and her heart finally, fully at home, in exactly the place she had once feared she had lost forever. 2 years had passed since the night Eleanor Whitfield walked out of Ashcombe Manor into a storm, believing herself entirely forgotten by the world, and the manor she now called home bore little resemblance to the house of quiet tension and hidden schemes it had once been. Sunlight spilled generously through the tall windows of the library on a bright spring morning as Eleanor, now Duchess of Ashcombe, sat curled in her favorite chair near the fireplace, a book resting forgotten in her lap while she watched her husband pace slowly along the shelves, searching for a particular volume he had promised to read to their infant daughter that evening. Their daughter, named Grace in honor of the widow who had taken Eleanor in on that first terrible night, slept soundly in a cradle nearby, occasionally stirring at the sound of her father's footsteps but never quite waking. Eleanor watched the pair of them with a warmth that still, even after 2 years of marriage, occasionally caught her by surprise, a quiet disbelief at how completely her life had transformed from the frightened, uncertain woman who had once walked alone down a dark and rain-soaked road. "You are staring again," Alexander said without turning, a faint smile evident in his voice as he continued searching the shelves. "I am allowed to stare at my own husband on occasion," Eleanor replied, amusement coloring her tone. "Particularly when he insists on reading poetry to a child too young to understand a single word of it." "She will understand eventually," Alexander said, finally locating the volume he sought, and turning to face her with evident satisfaction. "And I intend to have built quite a habit of it by the time she is old enough to appreciate the effort." Eleanor smiled, setting aside her book entirely, as Alexander crossed the room to join her, settling into the chair beside hers with the easy familiarity of 2 years spent building a life together. Much had changed at Ashcombe Manor since that fateful night, though certain quiet rituals remained unchanged, the same garden walks, the same library conversations, now simply deepened by the years and the trust they had built between them. Margaret had never returned to Ashcombe Manor after that final evening, though Alexander had kept his promise to see her and her son provided for according to the true terms of the estate, refusing to let his cousin's cruelty toward Eleanor extend to punishing an innocent child for his mother's schemes. Word occasionally reached them of Margaret's quiet life in a smaller property some distance from the county, and while reconciliation between the cousins remained distant and uncertain, Alexander had recently mentioned considering a cautious letter, prompted by the birth of his daughter and a growing sense that old wounds, however deep, need not remain entirely unhealed forever. Eleanor had encouraged the idea gently, understanding better than most the value of mercy freely given, even to those who had once shown none in return. Grace Bramwell visited the manor often, having become something of a beloved fixture in Eleanor's new life, and had taken particular delight in her namesake's arrival, insisting on being present for every possible occasion involving the infant Duchess-to-be. She had grown close as well with the household staff, many of whom remembered fondly the widow's role in Eleanor's darkest hour, and her visits invariably brought laughter and warmth to whatever corner of the manor she occupied. Charlotte Pembroke had married the following spring, a match Eleanor and Alexander had attended with genuine joy, grateful for the opportunity to celebrate the young woman whose courage in delivering her father's warning had helped avert disaster before it could fully unfold. Mr. Pembroke's reputation, far from suffering for his role in exposing Margaret's scheme, had only grown stronger among London's more discerning families, several of whom had specifically sought his services precisely because of the integrity he had demonstrated during that difficult affair. As for Eleanor herself, the transformation from dismissed companion to Duchess of Ashcombe had not come without its own quiet challenges. She had spent her first months in her new position, navigating the expectations and occasional skepticism of a society unaccustomed to seeing a woman of her modest origins rise so dramatically in station. But she had met each challenge with the same steady composure that had carried her through that first terrible night, refusing to be diminished by whispered doubts or condescending glances, and had gradually earned the genuine respect of even her most skeptical peers through simple consistency of character and quiet, unwavering kindness toward everyone she encountered, regardless of their own station. She had, in the 2 years since her marriage, established a small charitable initiative supporting young women left without family or resources, a cause that drew directly from her own experience of nearly losing everything in a single cruel evening. The initiative had already helped several young women secure respectable positions and safe lodging during difficult transitions in their own lives, and Eleanor found in the work a deep and abiding satisfaction, a sense that her own hardship had, in some meaningful way, been transformed into genuine good for others who might otherwise have faced similar struggles entirely alone. Alexander, too, had changed in ways both subtle and profound since that stormy night. The careful, somewhat distant reserve he had once maintained as a matter of habit had softened considerably, replaced by a warmth and openness that those who had known him only in his earlier years often remarked upon with evident surprise. He had grown, if anything, more attentive to the needs and struggles of those within his household and his wider estate, having learned firsthand how easily cruelty could hide behind the polished manners of those entrusted with power over others' lives and livelihoods. As the afternoon light shifted golden through the library windows, their daughter finally stirred fully awake, and Alexander rose to lift her gently from the cradle, settling back into his chair with the infant cradled carefully against his shoulder. Eleanor watched the two of them together, her husband's quiet murmur of nonsense words and gentle affection washing over their daughter as she blinked sleepily up at him, and felt a contentment so complete it occasionally still brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Do you ever think of that night?" Alexander asked quietly, glancing up to catch the faraway expression that had crossed her face. "Often," Eleanor admitted, "though not with the pain I once carried. I think of it now more as the beginning of everything, strange as that seems. Had your cousin never dismissed me so cruelly, had I never walked out into that storm, I wonder sometimes whether either of us would have found the courage to speak our true feelings at all, or whether we might have continued indefinitely in careful silence, too afraid of scandal and expectation to claim what we truly wanted." "A troubling thought," Alexander said, "though I confess I have wondered the same myself, more than once. Perhaps some difficult passages in life serve a purpose we cannot fully appreciate until we have made it safely through to the other side." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, reaching over to rest her hand gently against their daughter's small back as she finally drifted back to sleep against her father's shoulder, "though I would not wish such a passage on anyone else, however meaningful its outcome proved to be for us." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the afternoon light slowly shifting toward evening beyond the tall library windows, the manor around them quiet and settled in the particular way of a household that had finally, after so much turmoil, found genuine and lasting peace. Eleanor thought, as she often did in such quiet moments, of the curtsy she had offered on that terrible night, composed and dignified even amid utter humiliation, and of how completely that single, quiet act of defiance had come to define everything that followed. She had walked away that evening believing she had lost everything, and had instead, through storm and scheming and the slow, hard-won courage of honest hearts, found a life far richer and more complete than anything she could have imagined, standing frozen in that ballroom, hearing those cold and dismissive words for the very first time. Later that evening, after their daughter had been settled for the night and the household had grown quiet around them, Eleanor and Alexander walked together through the garden where so many of their earliest conversations had taken place, the same paths where careful glances and unspoken feelings had once lingered unacknowledged between them. The evening air carried the scent of early spring blossoms, and Eleanor found herself pausing near the small stone bench where Alexander had once read aloud to her from a battered volume of poetry, months before either of them had found the courage to name what was growing between them. "I received a letter from Mrs. Fenwick this morning," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "One of the young women from our initiative has secured a position as a schoolteacher in Bristol, entirely on her own merit, though I believe our small assistance helped steady her through the most difficult months of transition. She wrote the loveliest note of gratitude. You should be proud of that work, Alexander said, taking her hand as they continued their slow walk along the garden path. Prouder, I think, than any title this family could offer you. I am proud of it, Eleanor admitted. Though I confess it is a strange kind of gratitude I feel toward that terrible night. Alexander, had I not experienced firsthand what it means to lose everything through no fault of my own, I do not believe I would have understood so completely how urgently other women in similar circumstances need exactly the kind of support we now offer. They walked in silence for a while longer, past the roses just beginning to bud along the garden wall, past the fountain where Eleanor had once nervously awaited Alexander's arrival during the earliest days of their acquaintance, when neither of them had dared imagine the life that eventually unfolded between them. The estate around them, once a place of hidden schemes and careful secrets, had settled into something far warmer and more honest, its halls now filled with laughter and quiet contentment rather than the guarded tension that had once permeated every corner. Alexander paused near the fountain, turning to face Eleanor fully, the last light of evening catching gently in her hair. I have been thinking, he said, that we ought to hold a small gathering this summer, nothing so grand as our previous balls, but something to mark the anniversary of your initiative's founding. A chance to properly celebrate the good it has done, and perhaps to encourage others among our acquaintance to lend their support as well. I would like that very much, Eleanor said, smiling as she reached up to brush a stray strand of hair from his forehead, a gesture that had become as familiar and comforting as breathing over their years together. Though I hope you understand, Alexander, that whatever grand gatherings we host in years to come, none of them will ever mean quite so much to me as this quiet garden, and these quiet evenings, and the simple, steady life we have built together since that first terrible night finally led us here. Nor to me, Alexander agreed softly, drawing her close as the stars began to emerge above the darkening garden. Whatever storms life brings us in the years ahead, Eleanor, I intend to face them exactly as I should have faced that very first one, standing firmly and openly beside you, with nothing left unspoken between us. Grace, their daughter, would grow up knowing none of the fear or uncertainty her mother had once faced, secure always in the knowledge of exactly where she belonged and precisely how deeply she was loved, a legacy Eleanor considered, above every title or fortune that had come with her marriage, the truest and most meaningful victory of all.